Well, this is 3 weeks later, 3 weeks since riding into Paris, and I'm all right. I think I'm better than I expected and my team expected. You know, you go 2.5 months, 16 hours a day, 240 miles a day, 5 hours a night sleep. Sure, I've got a big background in endurance, but that's next level in every sense. So there's quite a lot of physical wind down to be done, you know, training down, psychologically just coming off that crazy focus for 11, 12 weeks. But I think all things considered, I feel remarkably good. I think ultimately, I mean, I often reflect on the fact that, you know, I train with bike riders who are stronger in a traditional sense. You know, they would win a crit race or a road race ahead of me. But what gives me the advantage to ride these ultra distances is a lot of practice. You know, 2 decades of experience pushing myself in terms of high mileage. And ultimately, you know, you can have the best team, have the best logistics, the best laid plan, but your ability to ride 18,000 miles in less than 80 days is really your ability to suffer. It's your ability to, you know, it's your grit. And I don't think I could have gone around the world this fast if I hadn't cycled around the world before. So in that sense, it's a psychological journey. Physically, it's really a question of, can you not injure? You know, it's not about how fast are you or, you know, what's your sprint like. It's about can you sustainably, for 16 hours a day with 5 hours sleep, never break down, never injure, and just keep going. If you can stick on the bike for 4 times 4 hour sets a day for what I did, you know, it worked out as 75 days riding, 3 days flights, 2 days contingency, and I just didn't use the whole contingency, which is why we brought home the record in 78 days, 14 hours and 40 minutes. So it was a well laid plan, took 3 years, and we pulled it off perfectly. So, you know, the question of mental, physical, it's the toughest physical challenge I've ever taken on. I mean, this was my Everest as a bike rider. So I certainly wouldn't want to make it sound easy in terms of riding the bike, but psychologically I think that's what would break most people. Sleep deprivation is kind of torture, and there was certainly periods where I was really, really suffering. By the time I got a couple of months in, so across North America, that was leg 3, so dipping south of the Great Lakes in the US and back up through eastern Canada, a place like Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, I was probably at my lowest ebb there. It's just that battle of attrition. You've been on the road for 2 months, you know, you kind of feel like you've played all your tricks, thought all your thoughts, and yet the road goes on. And you know, there's no point when you're having a tough day, you know, you're on the bike at 4 a.m. Thinking about even riding till 9, 10 o'clock that night, let alone Paris, which feels like, well, it is literally thousands and thousands and thousands of miles away. So you've got to play all sorts of mind tricks to keep the wheels turning. I mean, the beauty of a ride like this is it's a simple routine. I mean, okay, it's brilliantly complicated once you think of all the logistics and the team working around me and whatnot, but at the heart of it, get in 9,000 calories, sit on the bike for 16 hours, you know, don't take a wrong turning. Basically, as long as I look after myself on the bike and keep the wheels turning, the long-term average will take care of itself. So whether it's my best day with a tailwind and the sun shining, or the worst day, you know, really battling whatever's going on, I know that I just need to put the time in on the bike, and if I do that properly, I'll get around the world in 80 days. So that's why that was my mantra. You know, the flip side is you start to really try and ride harder when it's easy, and you sort of protect yourself when times are tough. And if you do that, it's too much of a psychological roller coaster. You know, if you just say, you know, there's so much I can't affect, but as long as I'm consistent with ride time, we'll crack this record. And keeping it as simple as that means that there's no excuse. You know, there's no sort of slipping back and sort of saying, well, I'll go easier today, or I'll take a little break. You know that you've got to put the time in, because it's so much easier to lose miles than gain miles. I mean, it would be incredibly easy to lose half a day on the record, and yet it would take a week, 2 weeks to make that back, and that's only if you've got a cracking tailwind and things go well. The thing you have to remember is 240 miles is not your best day. 240 miles is your average day. Okay. And you know, most good bike riders can just about get their head around, yeah, I could probably ride 240 miles if the sun was shining and I had a tailwind, but that's every single day. Yeah, and I'm often asked, you know, don't you think you're missing the point of the journey by going so fast? I would argue there's not a speed you can go at on the bike where you're not tuned into the world around you. People often ask me, would you go for the year record, the old Tommy Godwin record, classic, 1939, just riding miles every day. Massive respect for those that have gone for the record, but that's the antithesis of why I ride. I could not motivate myself to ride over 200 miles a day if it was just leaving my front door to ride. For me, it's the fact that riding these distances can take me around the world. And so as much as we planned the route meticulously, it's still the unknown every day. It's still the surprises that, I was covering nigh on 1,000 miles every 4 days. It's pretty exciting. And yeah, some real highlights for me. I love Mongolia. Okay. I mean, the Mongolia is exactly as you imagine it. It's picture postcard beautiful. It's maybe I loved it so much because it came straight after Russia, which was some of the toughest riding I've ever done. Really polluted, broken roads. I had a bad crash which made it pretty tough through Russia, but then I crossed into Mongolia and there were fantastic roads. I mean, the mining companies have built these fantastic roads through the Mongolian steppe and then the Gobi Desert, and you've just got this fenceless, open, treeless horizon, the odd yurt out in the wilderness, herds of wild horses alongside you. Keep in mind I rode through sunrise and sunset for 78 days. You get a wonderful sense of the entire day. Yeah, I mean, it was great to revisit some of the route that I rode 10 years ago. So I mean, 10 years ago when I cycled around the world, I was completely unsupported. I had all my kit with me, cook stove, the works. So going across Australia a decade ago was really tough because I had a headwind. So I came out the outback through the Adelaide Hills and then I guess skirting around the more populated part of Australia up to Brisbane. Did an almost identical route this time. But yes, once you get through the outback, which is pretty pan flat, you hit the Adelaide Hills, which are really punchy. I mean, the Tour Down Under, goes through there, and some pretty classic climbs. And then you drop down through Melbourne, and then cut through the sort of big farmlands up to. My biggest day actually was chasing the end of leg 2. That was like to the end of Australia. And my final day in Australia, 280 miles, which, awake at 4 o'clock, it was around freezing. And I'm in the middle of the Queensland, beautiful open farmland, and then by midday it's 25 degrees. And I rode till gone midnight that night, trying to get on the next flight to New Zealand. So very, very fond memories of that part of the world. I mean, any endurance rider will tell you that the biggest nemesis is the wind. The wind is as big a factor on the circumnavigation world record as it would for a sailing boat, and I don't think people who don't ride a bike would understand that. With a cracking headwind, I'll lose 60 miles on a good day, so I'll go 180, 190 rather than 240, 250. If the wind switched around exactly and I had the same wind as a cracking tailwind, it's not like I'm going to make 60 miles. I might make 30 or 40. So that's where the equation's slightly unfair. An amazing day is 270, 260 miles. Whereas, I remember in leg 3, I flew into Anchorage, and the first 7 days, coming through Alaska and the Yukon, down through the Continental Divide and the Rockies, the first 7 days had over 3,000 meters climbing a day. So I knew that would be a punchy start to leg 3. But then I was always telling myself, right, get to the prairies, get to the flatlands through Saskatchewan and then North Dakota, and it will flatten out and you'll fly. Like, I'll make up time and I'll really go for it. Well, in actual fact, I went slower than I did in the Rockies because I had a cracking headwind. And I mean, with that, I was struggling to do 200 miles a day. So psychologically, that's brutal. So I mean, I would happily do 220, 240 miles a day on a hilly day, because you do the climbs, but then the descent, you tend to average out your speed. So you might be crawling up a climb, but then you get a bit of recovery and you get to average out the speeds. But in the flatlands, when you've got a headwind, it's literally like you're riding uphill for 16 hours. There's no respite and there's no time to average out your speed. You are literally crawling all day. It's pretty demoralizing. And when that happens for 4 or 5 days on the trot, you're just looking for a break. And so I went from 4 days struggling to clear 200 miles. The wind swung around, and then I put in a couple of back-to-back 260s. So there you can see the difference that the wind makes. Well, I mean, I think considering the bike's now done over 18,000 miles, it's in remarkably good nick. And I mean, of course, I had a full-time mechanics and support team with me the entire time. I mean, people were questioning if you could take a lightweight carbon racy setup like this around the planet. And I mean, the bike was first and foremost incredibly comfortable and fast, and we had a fairly aero setup. I mean, if people were following, they would see that I was riding with an aero helmet with visor. Most of the time I was riding these 47s, the deep rim carbon wheels, so I mean they roll really quickly until you've got a massive side wind, and then I would drop onto the 32, sort of a shallower wheel. I would spend most of my time out here on the tri-bars. People always think, oh, you must get really tired legs cycling 240 miles a day. The muscles kind of take care of themselves. That's not too bad. It's the conditioning. It's the pressure sores on your cleats. It's you can still see this area sort of recovering, and then when you come off the lugs here onto the tri-bars, it's the neck angle. Okay. So you either put your hands here and you get the punishment of the road through the palms of the hands, or you drop onto the tri-bars, which is great for the hands, but then you get a sore neck, and of course the backside on the saddle. It's all those points of contact that are the real issue for anyone doing ultra endurance. And there's definitely still sort of slight nerve damage from that, but nothing that I don't think will recover over time. It's interesting that, I mean, I did a DEXA scan a couple of days ago, which is like a full body x-ray, shows bone density and muscle and fat and everything. So my bone density is down slightly because I've not really walked for 2.5 months. So I really need to train down quite carefully. I can happily ride 250 miles, but I get a sore back walking down the street. Yeah, 2 months. Okay. So 2 months training down, but it's pretty light. I mean, if you compare it to my training up schedule, it's a joke. It's I have to do it, but it's get in the swimming pool, take the dog for a walk, start to gradually go for jogs and runs again. But it's silly being so insanely fit to ride my bike and yet not really being fit to walk. So it's more about normalising my fitness, and I'm getting back out on the bike. I've done a number of rides, and it's good to keep the legs spinning. It's not like I'm scared of getting back on the bike. I'm thinking, I genuinely don't think so on the bike front. I mean, we spent so long putting together this and trialling and testing different parts, so I think we made a lot of those adjustments before the start. It was a pretty amazing setup, but you raised the obvious question. I mean, people are already asking, do you think your record will be broken, and when will it be broken? And I hope so. I'd happily mentor somebody and share all the secrets. That's what records are for. It's not for me to try and hold on to dearly. I'd love to see somebody give it a go, but nobody's going to break it by another 44 days, I'll tell you that. Yeah, I mean, you can see I've got the power meter on there, and I wouldn't ride by numbers most of the time, but whenever I hit the hills or hit a big headwind, I would watch the numbers just to make sure I wasn't overcooking it. It's so easy to go into the red. I'm a big, powerful guy. I can happily, sit at a fairly unsustainable level for 2-3 hours, and it'll only be the next day I notice. Okay. So yeah, I would, and it's difficult when you're in the hills, and so often people would join me and they were like, wow, you're riding really slowly, and I'm like, yeah, because that's what I'm doing tomorrow and the next day and the next day. It's harder when somebody joins you to still ride at your own pace, because it is a lot steadier than imagined. I was riding, if you look at my stats, I was riding sort of 100 beats per minute most of the time for 16 hours a day. And quite often people would join me, and of course they were sitting a lot higher than that, but that's because that's the level I've trained. It's the diesel engine, it's the ability to sit there all day, every day. I mean, we tried to change the food as much as possible. 9,000 calories is a lot of food. That said, I started eating at 3:30 in the morning, I'd finish eating at gone 10 o'clock at night. So you got a day to spread that over. I had an issue in the last 6 weeks with reflux, just keeping food down, because, as you tire, the blood obviously goes to your legs and the extremities to keep doing the exercise, and less blood going to the gut wall. I was obviously struggling to take in that amount of food. So that gets pretty boring on the bike when you're struggling to keep food down. A lot of just simple things to eat on the bike, wraps, things which, there's carbohydrate with a nice protein inside. Okay. A lot of shakes. I didn't eat any gels, very few sports bars, really avoided a lot of sort of processed foods, kept it as natural as possible. Yeah, I mean, inevitably you need to use caffeine and sugar carefully, but as the ride wore on and the sleep deprivation really kicked in, I would be on, if you put it on a graph, my caffeine intake was pretty sensible for the first month, and then it probably went up sort of exponentially. I was in the last 3-4 weeks, it was probably not particularly healthy, but ultimately, first and foremost, I was trying to stay safe on the bike and stay alert. And if I started to get drowsy at all, one of the coolest things on the way around. Okay, this was my personal dream, and I had an amazing team around me, but was the community that sort of grew up around it. It was amazing to see how the people sort of bought into the journey, came out and rode with me. And I mean, I know you guys at Bikmo were following it in a big way, and the support online was incredible. But I think for me, it went from that, my very simple ambition and people wondering whether it was possible or not, to that sort of global peloton, online peloton. You're going to do this. You're going to get around the world in 80 days. So it was really cool having you guys on board, and it was I could sense on the bike that sort of excitement and goodwill to get me around the planet in 80 days. So, especially through North America and Europe, the final push, we had to change the route quite a lot. To get out the wind, to make sure I wasn't battling unnecessarily, but also to fine tune it so we would hit 18,000 miles as closely as possible. I completely put trust in my team. They were amazing, and so I never really worried about which road I was on, or as far as I was concerned, I was never riding to any place every day. I was just riding by time. So as long as I did 4 times 4 hour sets on the bike, if they said turn left or turn right, it didn't really matter to me. I didn't get tied to any great plan. I sort of handed over that. The most important thing I could do in leadership before I started was tell them I'm not the boss anymore. I'm just the bike rider. You're in charge of performance, of logistics, of route setting, of everything. The media team, it's your game. Because if I became the decision maker on the road, I was way too sleep deprived and grumpy to do that. Yeah. So it was interesting because there was lots of tweaks to the plan, and I could see the stress on the team, the pressure on the team to get it right for the Guinness World Record. But it was completely on them. My job was just to ride the bike. I love the amount of people who have got in touch whilst I was on the road, and then since I finished, saying, they ran the world in 80 days has given them the confidence to get out and push bigger distances or go on that adventure they've been talking about but never actually committed to. And the wonderful thing about bike touring, adventure cycling, or like I've just done, actually going with a bit of support, it's a wonderful freedom. It's a unique perspective on the world, and it's actually not as complicated as you think. So this is not like sailing around the world or flying around the world. There's very little sort of barrier to entry to just getting on your bike and riding. And so the hardest thing for most people is just committing the time and the effort to do it. Putting that date in the diary and saying, I'm off. Whether that's John O'Groats Land's End, cycling across Europe, or getting out there and taking on the world. If I was to go back to any part of the world and explore more on a bike, it would probably be Africa, actually. I was riding around I was riding across Ontario, and this young lad joined me. He just left university, and he said, I'm off to cycle around the world. You've inspired me to explore the world on a bike. And I said, where are you off to? And he said, I'm going to Alaska and California and Florida. And I said, you're describing North America to me. I said, why don't you just get on a flight and go to Africa or the Middle East or Asia? And he was like, really? Could I do that? And I said, of course you could. And it'll probably be cheaper than riding around North America. Just go, pack your bike and go. And he left me a couple of hours later saying, I'm going to Africa with my bike. And I love that, because it's not his ability to do it or anyone's ability to do it. It's just having the confidence just to say, that's not for somebody else to do. That's for me to do. And obviously I'm addicted to it, but I've been to 130 countries in the last 10 years.